Hello, everyone, and welcome to the public space. Today we have an important episode, a special report. We will take the time that we need to take, but Frame Games here from Frame Games Radio has prepared a special report on demographics. And to remind people of how this platform works, the title and the thumbnail of this video are my choice. They are my choice in face of the facts that Frame Games will be bringing. In my view, what we are discussing today is a demonstration that white civilization is in the process of being completely replaced to a point where it will not be maintainable in its current state. What we see, in my view, is evidence that white populations will be replaced, that they will lose control on their democratic systems, to the point where these democratic systems will not, in my view, survive the events of replacement that we are about to discuss. What we are about to discuss, in my view, is not a reversible phenomenon. It is reversible locally if some group of white people get together and form a state and control its immigration. It may resist this kind of invasion. However, largely on the planet, the situation of white civilization is that they will be replaced, and this is not something that will change. The birth rates are too low. The population coming to replace us are in such good shape in terms of demographics and in terms of birth rate that within a few hundred years they will replace majorities in countries that used to be white. Frame Games, thank you for coming for this important special report. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me. I am doing great. I think that was a very good synopsis that you just covered there, and I'm looking forward to taking everyone tonight on a world tour of all of the major countries in Western civilization, and what's going to happen to them in this most critical of topics, and that is demographics. So I have three things that I want to stress tonight. Should I jump into them?
Absolutely, but you told me that before we come with the black pill subjects, there are some good news that you brought, which seems so small in comparison to the bad news that we will be reviewing. But go ahead on this.
You know what? That's so funny. I was going to start with the white pills of the day, which is my custom on my channel. Everyone in the chat, you can check me out on YouTube or on Twitter or on Gab, but. Yeah, it's just in light of the bigness of the topic, this just seems like such a drop in the pail. But I will start with them, which is that some good news this week. Oklahoma voter ID laws were upheld in appellate court. So this is something that's very important for stamping out fraud and preventing illegal voting. And since we're going to be talking about voting in demographic in representative democracies, this is a big win in a small pond. And the other one is that GOP turnout is way up. According to the most recent Tuesday primaries, there was a major trend reversal on Republican turnout enthusiasm, with GOP turnout being up 61% over 2014, up 43% in Ohio, and the GOP outperformed the Democrats in every single statewide race, basically up 48% in total over 2014 midterm elections. So whether or not this is a new trend of the Trump effect or sort of new dividing lines in the demographic voting patterns remains to be seen.
So in my view, this regain on the GOP side is probably reactionary. It's probably a reaction to the current situation, both in terms of immigration and in terms of the domination of the left over American politics, which is not as total as in Canada or France, but which is progressing certainly enough to awaken a part of the population that wants to resist. Is that your view on the GOP turnout results?
That is, and I would say what we're seeing right now is a coalescing of people around a Republican identity in a way that they have not before. And let me kind of go into what I mean by that. So there was a 9-point swing that was reported last week for millennial Democrats, moved 9 points over to Republicans in the past 2 years. So these are white Democrat males between 18 and 35, 9 points moved from Democrat to Republican during the Trump era. So this could be a dividing line, so sort of a new tectonic shift in the demographic voting patterns underneath us, where you really could be seeing a full-scale sort of sweep of middle-class whites abandoning all sort of hope and pretense for the economic wing of the Democratic Party. And if that happens, you really could see a major white pill that is a strong countervailing wind to what we'll be talking about tonight, which is an otherwise fairly black-pilling topic. But the fact that the times they are changing with young white liberals turning pro-Trump at the numbers that they are is certainly something to keep an eye on in a good way.
Absolutely. And I would say America, to me, in the racial situation, has always been on the fence. And so I'm not so black-pilled about America as I am about Canada. It does seem that if you count Hispanic whites as non-whites, and if you consider that they will take the direction of other minorities, then the situation in the US is as dark as anywhere else. However, to me, America is somehow protected, at least from the Muslim invasion, and probably through self-selection. There's probably many Muslims who don't want to live in America, and for that, it has still afforded a protection that Sweden could not obtain, France could not obtain, and Canada could not obtain in the number of Muslim migrants that they take in.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting that you mentioned the white versus non-Hispanic white split and some of the features that are unique to America, because there is a battle going on right now. Perhaps the biggest battle in American politics is over the Hispanic vote, and it's been going on now for about 30 years. And I can take you back to how that started. But I just sent you in the private chat here, in case you want to share it with the public chat, a leaked memo from Jennifer Palmieri, who was one of the top brass in Hillary Clinton's campaign. And it was a leaked memo that basically stressed how important it is to fight Trump on Hispanic brand loyalty matters. Because if you win the Hispanic vote, you will shore up a strategic win for generations to come. And so they, really talking about the way campaign managers look at demographics is similar to the way Coca-Cola looks at a ad on the back of a bus. I mean, they're really trying to shore up total brand loyalty, and if they can secure that, then you get hundreds of millions potentially of block votes, which is what has happened with the African American community. It's largely what's happened with the Jewish community, although there's a bit of a split with that. And it's what they're trying to do with the Hispanic community, who generally votes about 70-30 left wing. But the battle for this new majority coalition has been underfoot since at least the late 1980s. And it is the reason that you see the wheel of American commerce being wrapped around trying to win the Hispanic consumer, and all these identity politics geared towards the Reconquista happening in the American Southwest, which I'll cover here.
Absolutely, and this memo confirms that it's not a conspiracy theory or some spooky theory that the link between immigration and democracy is being used by people who are working in the system of democracy. Either they are supporting parties or they are directly agents of a party. Here, the memo that you sent me from the Center for American Progress, it has recognizable names that were exposed partly through WikiLeaks released about the Obama and Clinton organizations, and they are effectively strategizing to gain migrant votes, which of course is a reinforcement system. It's a feedback loop. The more you get the migrants on your side, the more your party will do more immigration. It will loosen up the rules for immigration. Then more migrants come in until the system crashes, which we haven't seen yet, but we are headed toward this. But before we look at the American situation in particular, because we will look at every country of interest that we have data on, of course, a lot of this data is unavailable. There are countries that are literally making it a law that you cannot track people by race. And so for these countries, the situation is probably at least as worse as the other, or even worse, but it's hidden. However, can you give us a big picture of what we're going to discuss today?
Sure thing. This is like a reverse Colbert Report, except it's it's on a bit of a more serious topic, but sure. So there are three things that I want to stress tonight in this special report. So the first one is there's a reason that democracy and demography sound so similar. They are essentially one and the same. The demography votes in the democracy. The will of the democracy determines what you will do as a country. Hence the saying, demographics is destiny. So I'm just going to set the stage for another minute here, and then I'll dive into this on a country-by-country basis. So in a representative democracy, which is what every Western civilization has, that's one person, one vote. Political power comes down mostly to the sheer number of bodies. This is why the Jewish state of Israel fights so hard to keep an ethnic Jewish majority over Arabs in Israel, prioritizing Jewish female birth rates and encouraging Jews in the diaspora to make aliyah and migrate to Israel. As a Jew, I will tell you that is a big part of our culture is next year in Jerusalem. And I'll return to that another time. The second point is that what you are about to hear is forbidden knowledge. JF just touched on this a bit, but you have to understand that as with the science of intelligence, the science of demography is a mostly forbidden field. That is, to be a demographer is to live in constant fear of what you might find. So as an example of this, there's a September 2000 Guardian article entitled, UK whites will be minority by 2100. And you can just Google that if you want. UK whites will be minority by 2100. And in this article from 2000, it's greatly accelerated since then. But there's a direct quote I'm going to read you to drive this point home. Here he says, the analysis of the figures in this article showed that if the population of ethnic minorities grows at 4% a year, whites will become a minority before 2100. And then the article says, the demographer who made this calculation wishes to remain anonymous for fears of accusation of racism. So merely reporting on this is probably a hate crime in many jurisdictions. It's certainly outlawed in many of them that I'll go over. It's outlawed in France, Germany, Sweden. I'm not sure about Italy, but all of these have strictly forbid the measurement of race from a government level, from a demography level, from a city planning perspective. You are simply not allowed to know facts related to race. And once
Absolutely.
you understand...
And Americans don't know that because you have polls in America. You go to the clinic and you click white or black or Hispanic. In France, these papers are illegal. You cannot ask someone their race. And in fact, some media personality, Eric Zemmour, he was just on a TV show, and people were contesting the idea of race, and he just said, well, he said to a black woman on a TV stage, well, it's evident to me that you are black and I am white. And he got sued for just saying this. This is considered not only racist in France, it is considered illegal. And so the level of talking about race that we can afford on this channel is a rarity in Western civilization. In most European countries, it could not be done either for social taboo reasons or, in the worst case, criminal law.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is why we really are the Galileos of our era here, JF. I mean, I don't want to overstate the case, but this is akin to being a cognitive neuroscience and being unable to report on the brain. Being a demographer and being unable to report on demography is a betrayal of science, and it's for strictly political ends. And maybe we can get into what those are exactly in the dialogue ahead, but let me just do a quick summary overview of some of the countries I'll be talking about. And I want the people who are listening to this to kind of imagine that you're 18 and you'll die at the age of 100. And it's 2018, so in 82 years, it will be 2100 on the day you die. Now, so all these things I'm going to be talking about in this dialogue here, you will watch happen over the course of your lifetime, and your grandchildren will be newborn babies coming into this world. Okay, so here is a short list of major Western nations and the year in which they will turn majority non-white. That is, civilizations built by indigenous Europeans who will no longer have Europeans as the identity of their nation. In America, it will happen sometime between 2040 and 2060. In the UK, it will happen in about 2070. In France, it will happen between 2050 and 2080. In Germany, it will happen between 2080 and 2100. In Italy, it'll happen in 2080. In Sweden, it'll happen between 2080 and 2090. And in Canada, it will happen in about 2106. So these are all calculations that I've compiled based on a large swath of well-sourced data. And I sent JF a long list of references with links for all of these, which include moderate estimations, aggressive estimations, and ideal estimations. And I've chosen, for the most part, the moderately aggressive timelines because there's so much censorship in this space that you have to assume not the worst necessarily, but you can't assume a wash. That is,
Absolutely.
you have to assume it's slightly.
I've not consulted your particular links yet, but I will say that I've done my own calculations on these for many months now, and this is absolutely reasonable calculations. We're talking about non-majorities in most Western countries. By the time we pass to 2100, the year 2100, most European countries will not be majority white.
Right. Yeah, and what I find particular, before we get into the specifics, when you're listening to this tonight, guys, think about the rest of your life. Think about the years you have ahead of you, your working years, your family years, your golden years. And remember that many of these dominoes will fall. Most of them will fall. If you're about 30 right now, they're going to start falling when you're about 70, 75. And those will be your golden years, and you will watch every single Western civilization lose its people who, I think, 40,000 years, somewhere between 40,000 and 200,000 years had relatively stable ethnic majorities in the places that they settled. And you're about to watch in your own lifetime this all come apart in your own eyes. So it's really something that when you take in the bigness of what we're about to cover, it truly is life-changing. No matter what you may have thought about the issues of the alt-right or nationalist right, for me, I consider myself part of the heart-right. I do believe in radical love and inclusion, but I also believe that diversity politics is for everyone or for no one, and that means it also has to include people from indigenous European heritage. So anyway, I want to just frame it like that before we get into the specifics.
And before we get into the specifics of each country, I will say the picture that we see here, if I look at this as a biologist, I look at it's amazing that it will happen in our lifetime, but I see the world over much larger time scales. I see the world over 50,000 years. And what historians and biologists will retain from our time is that people have emerged, the human species has emerged somewhere, probably Africa, at least as far as some of the Homo sapiens genes go, and then there may have been some crossbreeding with Neanderthals. What we will retain is that populations have spread across this planet over something like 10,000 years to 100,000 years. They have spread in all places. They have made these places more habitable. And the people who survived, the more distant people, the more people were traveling, the more they were selected for special skills. The Inuits were selected for their capacity to survive cold. White civilizations were probably selected for IQ. Asian civilizations too. But what's happening, what we see happening right now, is that this gain of IQ and this selection that has happened will be retained in history as the mere thing that allowed people to heat up the place, to make it more habitable for other, more productive breeder to eventually replace them.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think the evolutionary biology perspective is very instructive, especially when you start considering the role of identity politics and ethnocentricity in all of this. For example, the white European population has been subjected to about 100 years of constant propaganda to what Stephen Steinleicht calls in his article, The Jewish Stake in America's Changing Demographics, to widen their circle of community. That is, that's what many in the Jewish community consider their moral duty, is to educate the white population into having a wider sense of community. But this wider sense of community is not shared by the mostly North African, Middle Eastern, and other populations that are growing exponentially in Europe, and the Mexican populations that will become at the end of your lifetime, as you watch this, and we'll cover this. The number one most populous ethnic group in America in the year 2100, and well before that, is Mexican. And then after that, it will be Black. After that, it will be Germanic, and after that, it will be Anglo. But that will be the plurality demographic, and the question of whether or not those groups similarly widen their ethnocentric lens is one. The future is unwritten on that, but there are many factors tending to indicate that such groups may not have the same predilections as Europeans do, whose high trust societies may end up being the poison, a certain kind of a poison.
Absolutely. Now let's look at the specific data on the US. And before we do that, I'll review a few super chats. There are some questions that we will have answers for your questions, guys. First, thank you for those who subscribed as sponsors. It's a new option on my channel, $4.99 a month, and you support an ongoing stream of creation for you guys. There's already many sponsors who have registered. Thank you so much. Mask Wolf, thank for your donation. NQ Hang says, hi Jeff, I'm supporting your channel by watching through Brave browser. Don't forget to register your YouTube on Brave. I wasn't aware. I will do it. Benny says, press 1 to put... Oh, no, I will not read this one. First name, last name says, how will the outcome of the political shrimping scandal affect white civilization? He's a troll. I'm not reading these super chats anymore. Be more innovative in your trolling. Burger Fan, $2, says, Frame Game is a fantastic speaker. Do more with him. Good Time says, what's up with the Norwegian trashing? Denmark, go home. You are drunk. First last name says, shrimp in important regions will go extinct by 2023. Still trolling. Jodo says, what's the plan? Benny says, it's hateful love. Norwegians are our brothers. Peanut says, topic for your next debate. Are Jews, do they have a more higher IQ than whites? Yeah, it's a good debate subject. Sean Taylor says, what year are we talking for when about 50% of the population is non-white under the age of 30? That will be the real tipping point, and it will come much sooner than 100 years.
Yes.
I think that we will have an answer to this, but I think it's essentially right now or very soon, right, Frame Games?
Yes, in fact, that's going to be the first topic we cover, is the concept of demographic momentum. And I just sent you a link in the lobby to a YouTube video. It's about 2 minutes, and it describes it very well for the audience, in case you feel that would be appropriate.
All right. Well, if you can explain us, I will leave the link in the description, but if you can explain us what the video says.
Sure. So what he's referring to is the concept of demographic momentum. It's an extremely important topic in the study of demography. And what it says is that even if two populations are the exact same size and they have the same number of children, the population with the younger age structure will reproduce substantially more because so many of its members are pre-reproductive. So as an example of this, in the USA, the 2010 census data showed that the median age for whites was 42 years. For Hispanics, it was 27.3. And for populations marking more than one race, it was a staggering 19.9. So you're talking about populations that are twice as young as the white population. And even though that they may have... it may look like there's some degree of parity right now, what you'll see in 20 years is a parabolic snowball effect.
Absolutely. And that's why raw population numbers are not as telling as key factors like the one you mentioned, the age of the population, the momentum, and also the age at which women start having babies, because if you can compress your generations within 18 years instead of 27 years, then if it accumulates over 2 or 3 generations, you'll end up with much more people emerging from the women who produce babies when they are 18 versus the women who produce babies when they are 27. So demographics and its relation to birth rates is all the key. The key part is the reproductive age of females and the span of this reproductive age.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And that's in fact exacerbated by a number of other factors that we'll go over. So now that we're situated in America and we're going to do our world tour here, we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into what's going on in America right now. What's going to change? How is it going to change? When is it going to change? And where will it change? So, as I mentioned, it's really Mexico. It really, really is. That is by far and away the largest source of demographic displacement. And the current timeline, according to current trends, white people will become an official minority, or more accurately, a plurality, between the year 2040 and 2050 in America. Now, that's on a nationwide basis. Now, many in the chat have heard this. It's been trumpeted for about 15 years. This is not a new fact, although it is scrupulously hidden from those who would seek to use it to mobilize some way to stop it. I can get into efforts along that, which are often humorous. But I'm going to start our journey in the state of Texas. So Texas has a sort of unique place in American lore as being the most American state of all. The Dallas Cowboys are America's team. We've had many presidents, including the Bushes, from Texas. It is the Don't Mess with Texas state. It is the state of the Alamo, which I visited as a kid, which is the heroic stand of European America against an invasive Mexican army. And what's really instructive about the Battle of Alamo is that it was very few against very many. It was about, I don't know, maybe about 100 troops or less stationed up in one little fort up against hundreds and thousands of troops. And they held the fort for long enough for reinforcements to come and defend America. So I think that that's a very apt analogy for where we are right now. There are some outcards in the deck that I do see, but I want to make sure everyone knows realistically where we are before we talk about the outcards. You have to know that the deck is quite stacked. So here's what's going to happen in Texas. Texas will become a blue state in 2024 or shortly thereafter. Now, that's probably one of the most horrifying things you'll hear tonight to people who are in America and who are alt-light. People who are maybe libertarian, they just watch the stream for the lulz. Texas will turn blue in 2024 because of the following statistic. Texas led the nation in child population growth. There were 979,000 young people added to the state of Texas this past year. 931,000 of them were Hispanic. That's 95% of all young people who came to Texas were Hispanic. So 95% of a million in a single year. So keep that in mind. Once Texas turns blue, it will do the same thing that California did, except there will be no place to run. In fact, you can argue there was no place to run after Reagan granted amnesty in 1986 and gave up California, because after that, there was true SJW identity politics on a mass and unforgiving scale. You can only imagine what will happen when Texas falls the same way. As many of you who followed me for some time know, you can start with South Africa as a pretty good blueprint, then go to Zimbabwe, then go to Haiti, then go to Detroit, then Baltimore, etc. National politics will be forever twisted in 6 years. You have 6 years. You don't have 60, you don't have 100. You have 6 years before this changes your life forever. So,
and this is one of the reasons why even moderate estimation, which we abide by, which are based on birth rates and current immigration, all of these are underestimations of what will happen. Because what will happen when Texas is a blue state? Well, there will be more leftist policies. There will be more demands for immigration. There will be more contestation against the wall. And so whatever we tell you today is in some way, because we don't include these democratic shifts in our calculations, is probably the best picture scenario, and reality will almost certainly be worse than this and faster than this.
Well, part of it is because as it's happening, there will be many efforts from the inside to accelerate it. That is, it is a binding issue that Hispanics will tend to support measures that promote the welfare of Hispanics, including the maintaining of DACA, the forbidding of the wall from being built, and numerous others. Although there are tectonic shifts that we'll get into there. But the main thing is it's very much like when you're forced because of a class action lawsuit. For those who don't know, I have an attorney background. When you are subject to a civil rights class action lawsuit because of some racial discrimination or hostile work environment case, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars at stake because of the treble damages that are empowered under U.S. law. Often, what is done as part of the settlement is an agreement, a binding agreement by the executive board to bring on more diversity to the executive board, not just to diversify the down ranks. And then, I've charted this with many companies. What usually ends up happening is the moment you have diversity on your executive board, the first thing the diversity lobbies for on your executive board is more diversity and more diversity. And then there is this phenomenon of convergence that Vox Day talks about, where it starts to look like the purpose of the company is not to sell widgets, but to promote social justice. And if it just so happens to promote widgets along the way, then that's great. And this is usually the social justice death spiral of many mid-tier companies. But with that detour, I'm going to fast forward in the U.S. to so you have the overview. Whites will become a minority in 2040 and between 2040 and 2050. Although you will probably not hear the media report it as the word minority, they'll use the word plurality to make it seem that whites are not being so badly disempowered. Plurality means the largest minority group with no clear winner. That is, if there are three people up for an election and one person gets 40% of the vote and the other two people get 30% of the vote, the 40% winner is said to win by plurality, not by majority. And this often has many interesting ramifications to it, because often a majority is needed for various legislative changes to be pushed through. It's often, in corporate bylaws, there's often a very big difference between a plurality and a majority. But the simple answer to it is that a majority gives you a clear mandate, and a plurality gives you kind of a best among others. So one gives you a clear identity. The others, you have many balkanized identities clamoring for each other, with one just kind of emerging out of the pack. So it's a way to remove identity altogether from the face of the nation, which we saw again with that ACLU baby case, where when the ACLU tweeted a picture of a white blonde baby waving an American flag, and then was met with a torrent of SJW social media mob telling them that it was racist to say that a white blonde baby would be the face of the nation in the future. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the foremost defender of free speech in our country on a legal basis, they took down their own tweet and apologized, groveled, and said, "Thank you for calling us out." This is what happens when you lose your face. But you can bet that other groups will want their face on the postcard, because after all, you do need a face on the postcard, whatever that face is. So in the
Absolutely.
year
And
20,
this phenomenon, although Canada is not in the racial situation of the US, this phenomenon is present ideologically in Canada. Everyone likes diversities. Diversities is actively promoted by state propaganda to children and to adults through media that are controlled by the state, because diversity has been introduced at the level I would compare it. Diversity is in our constitution in the same way the First Amendment is important to Americans. And so in Canada, the speech for diversity is systematically favored. Essentially, if you can find that you're anything else than a white heterosexual man, you can get those points of diversity and you can get positive coverage, including in private media corporations and in the state controlled corporations.
right? And we will get to Canada. JF, you're not as safe as you might think.
Oh, I don't think I'm safe, but I know that the threat of Canada is a totally different type of immigration than the US. It is not
Right.
Hispanics, it is not blacks who are just within the country. It is immigration from Middle East, Indian from India, and so it's a very different situation. North Africa also, and French Arabs in general for Quebec. This is a very different situation, but I know that it's just as dark, I would say.
Okay. Well, we'll get to Canada next. I will wrap up the U.S. now and just say, remember, the year is 2100. You've lived a long life, guys. You have kids, you have grandkids. And the year is now 2100. Whites are now between 30 and 40% of the U.S. population, probably closer to 30 because of some funny business we'll get into in terms of how these Census Bureau data is actually collected. But you will live in a world in which whites will be 30% of America. Hispanics will also be about 30% of America. African Americans will be between 15 and 20% of America, and Asians, which includes Middle Eastern and North African, will be about 5 to 10%. So you may be able to send your kids to private school now, but imagine a world where it is 30% white, and not just that, you have social norms and legal doctrines that mandate proportional representation, meaning no matter how good you are, 7 out of those 10 slots are going to have to go to non-whites in everything, in education, in jobs, in promotion, last to get hired, first to get fired, in positions of government, all the way on down the line. And we'll talk about different decision trees along this. But you may think of America as a white country. On the day you die, it will be 30% white. So I just want to drive that home so you really understand it. Again, the most popular ethnicities will be Mexican, Black, then German, and Anglo. And now maybe just a few other data points, and then we'll move on to Canada. So you understand just how pervasive a problem this is. This is, and JF said this in his intro, 46 of the 50 states in America registered declines in their white child populations from 2000 to 2010, the last data that was collected, the last census. Meanwhile, Hispanic youth populations grew in all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, and in every single large metropolitan area except one city, and that's LA. And that's just because people in LA moved out of the greater LA district because of expenses. But they are, they're...
it's a very mobile city. It's people going there and then leaving. So it's more a mirror of who has access to lots of money and who has access to moving a lot for their job, particularly.
So 50 out of 50 Hispanic growth skyrocketed, and 46 out of 50 white populations actually declined. Not even at maintenance level. So we'll return to the big picture after we get through the tour of the countries. So Canada, we'll move on to Canada now. Canada is a country that has been historically almost exclusively white. It has a current population of about 36 million. So that's about a tenth of the size of the US. And in the year 2100, it's estimated to have about 55 million, between 55 and 100 million. And the reason I bring this up is because there's a big debate right now among the dominant SJW orthodoxy in Canada about whether to target 50 million or 100 million for 2100 as part of the population management regime. And the reason is in order to push through this basically political power and eternal, racial communism agenda, there is this economic excuse that is used that if you bring in third world labor, that it will increase GDP. Meanwhile, they will all vote for the party that let them in. So it's basically a way of secure. It's basically like doing the African National Congress in South Africa. That's what they did. I mean, it's all racial politics, and then they use economics on occasion as a means to solidify solidarity with demographic bloc voting. So anyway, if 100 million is the targeted population for 2100. This will be extremely accelerated because those 100 million will be coming from refugees, mostly from Africa and from the Middle East. And when we get to what Steve Saylor calls the most important graph in the world, that is the total explosion in African population boom in the next 80 years, the fact that they will want to go somewhere in a mobile world with multicultural regimes in Europe, America, Canada, and to some extent Australia, which we'll get to later in the list, you'll see that the floodgates are very much likely to open to everyone, literally everyone, especially in Africa. So,
and there will also be countries that will resist to waves of immigration. Maybe nationalists will win in some countries, and this will just make the situation of refugees worse for those countries like Canada, who I cannot see how Canada could cut itself from immigration. And so these countries will be faced with even more suffering, even more people requesting in, and they will be cucked by other countries which may have taken the nationalist route, if any does.
Right. Yep. In fact, there was that interesting case of Israel trying to move the 30 to 40,000 Ethiopian refugees or African refugees out of Israel. And I think where they were going to park them after some negotiations about parking them in Europe, I think they were going to park them in Canada. And I think Canada was going to open them with open arms until left-wing Jewish factions actually stepped in, like J Street, and said that they wanted a better deal. And then you also had the right-wing parties in Israel and the Likud party who were saying that not enough migrants were being kicked out from Israel. So they're taking some time to basically regroup at their political capital to dump it on Canada then.
When your race survival relies on leftist Jews that live among you, you are in bad shape.
Yes, probably not negotiating from strength, I'd say. So Canada has some interesting schizophrenia with respect to its racial demographic data. Generally, they use the phrase visible minorities rather than black or white or Middle Eastern in their data. And so according to their own census data, 50 years ago, the percent of visible minorities in Canada was, what do you think it was, JF? Take a guess.
It was very little, because I remember that all of my ancestors, my fathers, my grandfather, they give me the picture of a very homogeneous Quebec and Canada. I would say it must be below 5%.
Yes, that's right. So currently, the percent of visible minorities in Canada is 19.1%. 50 years ago, it was just 2%. So.
50 years. We switched from 2% to 19.1%. That's a 17% gain. In terms of percentage of increase, we're talking about tenfold increase in 50 years.
Yep. And you can guess what side of the acceleration curve it's on right now. So this is by 2031, the number is expected to grow to 31%. Vancouver and Toronto are expected to become majority minority cities, meaning white minority cities, with 50% non-white minorities in Vancouver and Toronto by 2031. So that's 13 years away. In 13 years away, Canada will be less than 70% white. and its major capital cities will be non-white, just like as what happened in London, which now has a higher crime rate than New York, higher homicide rate. Canada as a whole will turn non-white majority by the year 2106, according to the work of the University of Laval's Patrice Dion, who is a statistics Canadian official. So this is a little bit of wrongthink that he published, but by 2100, only 20% of Canada will be white. Does that shock you, JF?
It is shocking when when you feel that culture, and probably, what's the saddest thing? Probably 14 years old in Canada will not be shocked by this, because I think they've been sold the multiculturalism of Canada so much that they will enjoy it. But for me, who has been educated in an environment where it was racially homogeneous and Quebec culture was something important to us, it's absolutely shocking.
20% in 2106. So you might live to see that day. I mean, especially with, modern technology, you might watch in your golden years. See, what I'm trying to do here, guys who are watching the stream, this is time capsule night. What I want you to do is I want you to avoid that feeling when you're 70, 80, 90, and you're watching every single Western domino fall, and think to yourself, you know what? If I'd done something, if I charted a different course when I was 20 or 30, I could have done something. I could have organized people. I could have streamed on YouTube. I could have written a book. I could have started a local club. I could have talked to people at university. I could have done something 60 years ago. That's what we're trying to tell you on the stream right now. Now is the time. This is the Alamo. But let me tell you some more of, Jeff, have you ever seen the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid?
I didn't.
It's a classic Western where you know what, you're doing these great movie reviews now. I would highly encourage you to check out this movie. It's classic American cinema, and it's these two cowboys who are ruffians. One of them is the best shot in the West. The other one is sort of the smartest crook in the West. They get chased all over the country by the smartest law officials in the world, and they end up having to move to Bolivia. And they're robbing trains, they're robbing banks. They think they finally escaped the law, until finally, at the last scene in the movie, they're holed up in an Alamo, basically. And they go out guns blazing, thinking that this is just another firefight. But little do they know that they've made so much noise over through Bolivia and through America, and with robbing so much, that the entire Bolivian army is waiting for them. So tens of thousands of troops are waiting for them outside, and they're just two people. And the movie ends with these artillery blasts, just total overkill. So that's sort of where we are right now. If you wait another 20, 30 years to take this issue seriously, you will find yourself like Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, holed up in Bolivia, because you will be surrounded by such a demographic snowball that if one politician decides they want a 15% white tax as reparations for the legacy of slavery or Jim Crow or Holocaust or whatever you name it, you will not, that won't be a joke. You will have 20% of the population to try to resist that with. And 150 years ago, there were as many whites as blacks in South Africa. But when apartheid ended and it became representative democracy, one body, one vote, then there was absolutely no way to prevent the sheer parliamentary vote of expropriation of your homes, your tractors, your land. Total lack of law enforcement.
That you may have a feeling of security in your current societies. These societies and these rules have been made by white people. There is never a guarantee that the people who will replace your descendants will be as grateful and as kind to you as your ancestors have been to them. That's the ultimate weakness of white civilization. It's too kind. And if I had to make a bet, it would be that any other group of people will never be as kind to whites as whites have been to immigration of all kinds.
Yeah, I can't think of a single historical example that goes against the point you just made. So, and I've been doing this a long time, so that's exactly right, and it's how I feel too. So just so you're keeping track on the scoreboard: America in 2045, Canada in 2100. So let's move now to the UK. So according to 2010 research, the census data from 2010, the latest one, found that white Britons, defined as white English, Welsh, Scottish, or Irish, will be a minority in the UK by 2066 if immigration continues at the current rate, and by 2100 if it doesn't. So it'll be between 2065 basically and 2100 that the UK becomes non-white, possibly much faster than that, because again, these are fairly conservative estimates. So already 45% of the population of, I'm sorry, London is now majority. That was 2011 data. As of 2017, whites are now no longer the majority racial group in their capital city, London. You had in 2016, mothers born outside the UK accounted for 30% of births in England and Wales. The name Mohammed has been the most popular baby name in England and Wales every year since 2011. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But essentially, you're looking at UK will fall between 2065. So you're looking at 45 years basically, and ever increasingly along the way.
And one aspect we've not covered is that in some of these cases, Canada and the UK, there is a coordination in minorities, particularly of of Muslim populations. These people also have ideological programs that they can share. And so you may find them not too invasive in your life if you live in a neighborhood where there's some Muslims, but we're talking about a major population shift, and at some point these people will gather in mosques and they will coordinate politically.
Yeah, and I also want to just say as a disclaimer, to the chat and to people who are watching this, I don't think that, I was just in Hungary, and there's a substantial Muslim population there, and there's no unrest that's really being caused by the Muslim population there, because they're not organized. I mean, to me, the demography matters, but it's really when demography is matched with identity politics, that is the organized political power that mobilizes an ethnic group or a religious group into a block vote that votes purely ethnocentrically and is basically an unshakable internal bloc. That's when you start getting warring coalitions. I mean, Hungary has issues with gypsies, but by and large, the Muslims there, they own their halal shops. They sell, kebab, and they get along very well. In fact, I interviewed a number of locals in Hungary while I was there, and it's instructive to keep in mind that when we talk about this, I come from a position on love of all this. I do think that if Western civilization can weather the storm, that technology will allow us to all kind of maybe transcend this, in a century or two. If we can not go back into the dark ages, as would happen to Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Haiti, Rhodesia, and all the other list of.
It's hard to know whether you're trolling Frame Games. It's like, of course, there's all these facts and there's all these examples in the past that have not worked, but maybe it will work.
Well, it's the difference between deterministic and probabilistic, right? I'm trying to stay as quantum as possible, right? Like, this is not set in stone. Take action today if you're watching this, all right? Like red pill one friend, to make it your personal mission. In the month of May, get one friend red pilled, one friend or family member. If you do that, if everyone in this stream does that one thing, you will have started your own snowball. So anyway, we'll move on to France now. So again, every time I'm going to reiterate the scoreboard. America turns non-white in 2045. Canada turns non-white in 2100. And France is going to turn non-white in about sometime between 2050 and 2080. Now, France is interesting because France prohibits using any ethnic data for any government purpose. It's very much like Sweden or Germany. But there are some wily crime thinkers on the internet who have, much like a 4chan "he will not divide us" operation, have used the constellation of stars to deduce the data that I'm about to tell you. And it's pretty shocking. And it's also one of these things that will creep up on people who are not watching this stream very suddenly, because most French people don't have access to this data. It will be called hate speech on whatever AI algorithms detect it as such or are flagged as such on social media, and their demographers would be jailed for talking about it. So anyway.
And as someone once said to me, there's a reason why you make certain speech illegal. It's because it's shocking and people don't want to hear it, the people who make those laws. And so it is a shocking situation. I can't wait for you to describe the situation.
Yeah. So in France, the constellation was figured out as follows. So there was 2009 data that was released. Now, again, this is 10 years old at this point, that estimated that there were about 4 to 7 million Arabs, 3 to 5 million blacks, about 1.5 million Asians, and about 600,000 Jews. And that those estimates as of 2009 constituted about 22% of France's population. So that was 10 years ago. It was 22%. And again, remember these parabolic slopes and remember demographic momentum. So France does medical statistics regarding the percentage of newborns who are screened for certain diseases that are endemic to certain ethnic populations. So, for example, sickle cell or Tay-Sachs. So sickle cell, black Frenchmen are screened for sickle cell. And so one way to estimate population data is to simply accumulate medical records for newborn babies. So that's what the renegade demographers have done to cull the data that I'm telling you now about France, where again it will become majority non-white in between 2050 and 2080. So again, if you're 30 years old watching this, in sometime between your 60s and your 80s, France will become non-white unless you do something. All right. Anyway, so these figures put white newborns in, as of 2012, at 34.44% of the population. 6 years. So that is that's pretty massive. The France had a very, very serious female fertility problem that has mercifully come back up in recent years. They're now sitting at about 1.9. So replacement is 2.1. So white people are still dying year over year in France, but they're dying less frequently than they were, less aggressively than they were as of a couple of years ago, when they were down to about 1.4. It was some crazy number. So I could go on with more and more statistics, but let me just do an overview of all the countries so that we have time for it all. So keep that in mind, between 2050 and 2080. So Germany also forbids the collection of racial statistics. This extends to schools, universities, jobs, and the like. But still, using the constellation of immigrant data, which includes country of origin, and then assuming an average white European birth rate, there will be a non-white majority in the 20 to 30 age group within 4 years, and minority status between 2080 and 2100.
So we're talking about 2022, Germany, the most vital part of Germany, the young people between 20 to 30, in 4 years, there will be a minority majority.
Yes. In 4 years, yes, that group will. What you'll have is the last vestiges of sort of white European, I don't even know if you want to call it a white European sort of political power in Germany, just because it's such a co-opted state for so many reasons. I mean, it's really, it's kind of like a neutral player character. It's like it doesn't have a mind of its own. The will of the German people has absolutely nothing to do with the political decisions of the people there. SWAT teams kick in hundreds of homes a month for hate speech and other thought crimes. But in 2017, Frankfurt became the first German city where Germans are a minority. So the glorious history of Frankfurt is now a non-white city, and that just happened last year. So, what's especially interesting when thinking about trends is here's a quote from the Germany's development minister in 2016, who proclaimed that Europe has barely even seen the start of the migrant influx. He said only 10% of Syrian and Iraqi migrants have reached Europe so far, and another 8 to 10 million are on the way. So again, he said this only a year and a half ago, with even more to come from Africa. Here's his quote: "The biggest movements are ahead. Africa's population will double in the coming decades, and we will need to make room for them." He said that the digital age we live in will make more people than ever know about the prosperity of Western nations, thus making it more likely and more possible for them to try to travel here. And when we get into the Africa population boom, you'll see just how dramatic that is. Now, for those who don't know, there's a fascinating piece of geopolitical history here, which is that Gaddafi, whose regime in Libya was overthrown in 2011 for reasons I don't think anybody even remembers anymore. Gaddafi was the bottleneck. He was the choke point between Africa and Europe. In fact, many times he threatened Italy, France, he threatened Berlusconi and several other world leaders that if they ever took him down, that he would flood Europe with black people. Yeah. Now, again, So you can actually just Google this and you'll see these headlines. I mean, they're in all, these are in major newspapers that's reported. Not that I give any credit to major newspapers, but it is, it's cartoonishly real. It's so real that it's the kind of thing that you instinctively don't believe, because if only part of it was true, you'd have to contemplate the ramifications of that and reconsider everything you were told. So it's just easier not to think that Gaddafi literally said that he would flood the country with Africans in 2011 if he went down. Then he was deliberately taken down by Germany, by the UK, by France, by America. I mean, these were joint leads. I mean, there were a few other nations in there, from what I recall. And lo and behold, what happened right after that? The African migrant crisis. So talk about
We've
activating
essentially
the
opened the corridor to our own invasion.
That's exactly right. Gaddafi actually greatly modernized Libya before he was taken down. I mean, if you understood that there's so many levels of tragedy and deception and genocide, and that if you only knew 30% of it, it would be enough for you to try to spend the next month red pilling all of your friends. I mean, this is critical red alert territory we're in. So I'm going to move on with the countries now, unless you want to chime in with anything, Jeff.
No, let's move on to Sweden, which I believe is the foremost applier of these systematic invasion through immigration laws. It is one of the most at-risk country. In fact, at-risk is not the word at this point. It is one of the countries that will certainly fall to its own immigration policies.
Yes, that is true. I will sort of couch that by saying that I was interested in compiling this data, that in terms of Sweden becoming a non-white country, it's actually substantially farther away than other countries. Sweden's problems are mostly political, and they're mostly political and future demographic. They're actually not in the red territory right now from a purely demographic perspective, which was something that actually surprised me a little bit. But you would imagine that. Okay, let me just dive right in. So,
well, I'd like you to tell me the data, because I'm very surprised you reached this conclusion. I will note that Sweden, the data is not high quality there, but we do have good data for the Muslim part of the population, and it's one of the fastest growing Muslim populations in all of Western civilization.
Right. No, that is true. But it started with a smaller amount than countries like Germany or France or the UK took in. It was fairly recent that the gates swung open for Sweden. I mean, there was a open gates policy in many European countries, sort of long before it hit Sweden. Sweden was sort of a homogenous, feminist, socialist country for about a decade before the ethnic issues hit the way they did. And the reason that we hear about Sweden as such a horrible, the reason that it's so infected the way that it is because you did that movie review of Demolition Man. I mean,
Yeah.
Sweden really is, you drop one Wesley Snipes in Sweden, and there's no way to deal with it. There's no legal repercussion. There's no cultural norms. It's just, if they get through the gate, the whole cell gets, one single strand of DNA can change the whole cell, the way the whole cell operates. So anyway, Sweden is currently, by the way, when I make these analogies, I say this with love in my heart. I want to disarm identity politics altogether, and I want all people to be able to have pride in who they are. That's the reason that I say these things. It's out of political necessity, and I want to make sure that it's clear that I'm saying this out of love, but also out of urgency, deep urgency. So anyway, Sweden is currently about 8% Muslim. And in the year 2050, it will be about 20% Muslim. So that is, and part of it is because these are very new people here, right? It's not like, we're still in sort of the end of stage one of the demographic momentum, whereas other sort of countries are more in stage two, where the snowball's already gotten rolling. So the proportion of people with a foreign background, though, is approaching 30% of the population, even though only 8% are Muslim. This is because Sweden takes in a large number of immigrants who are actually European. So they take in a lot of Poles. So a lot of what we hear about ethnic Swedes being imminently minority in their own country, which is imminent, ethnic Swedes will become a minority at about 2060. It's just that many of those who will be replacing ethnic Swedes will actually be Polish people. They'll be basically, a lot of Eastern Europeans go to Sweden for the same economic reasons that Africans and Middle Easterners do. But what's interesting is that the number of ethnic Swedes has been decreasing by, since 2000. It's decreased by more than 100,000, while the number of people with foreign backgrounds has increased by well more than 1 million. So there's a negative birth rate. Meanwhile, you have more and more immigration and no defenses to setting up these, Malmo, Sharia states, and then, applying demographic pressure politically and culturally. But according to this, in about 2060, ethnic Swedes will be a minority, and sometime between 2080 and 2100, Swedes are targeted to become a minority, although that may stretch into the early 2100s, depending on just how aggressive they continue to be.
Right.
So now Italy, I'll make it short and sweet from here. Italy has been pounded, right? Because they were you don't hear about Italy much, but Italy is a great nation. That is where Rome is. It's where Sicily is. It's where Venice. A lot of great civilizations started in Italy. Italy will be a minority white population by 2080, and minority Italian well before that, at around 2050. So here you have, before the year 2100, that is, all of you in the chat will live to see this with your own eyes. You will watch Italy, France, Sweden, the UK, Germany, Canada, and the US all turn non-white before your very eyes, year by year. So start telling people, share this video with a normie. Share JF's channel. I mean, this is an opportunity now. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few other tail nations. Do you mind? Do we have time, JF?
No,
How are we doing?
let's go. One thing I noticed, because we've been around Europe, do you think that being part of the European Union has significantly weakened these countries, as opposed to more northern countries, or countries who didn't join the EU, or are just at the border?
Oh, absolutely. And because here's why. When you have a United Nations, when you have an EU, and I say United Nations in the sort of global sense of it, that is a centralized decision maker, a globalist decision maker, then what you have are, nobody is invested in the soil. right? So there's that saying, blut and bolt, right? Blood and soil, which, is a phrase with its own sort of baggage for whatever reasons, but I still think it's a useful phrase to keep in mind because it gets to the primal essence of the human connection to the land. And what happens is if you are Poland and you are being governed by Brussels, Brussels doesn't have a connection to the land. So it doesn't matter to Brussels whether the Polish people live there or whether the Cossacks live there or whether the Armenians, like none of that. So what you do is the presence of the EU is an inherently anti-nationalistic force. And so it prevents the mobilization of people along the lines of their blood and soil. And not only that, you really get a bunch of international power players. That's when you get the international banks. That's when you get the international embassies. That's when you get all the Fortune 500 companies, all signing joint pacts that they won't do business with people who don't play ball. And it's something that you brought up earlier when you were talking about how Canada might be bombarded if certain nations wise up, become right-wing nationalist, and don't accept migrants. So an instructive case study there is Poland and Hungary. So there's a saying in Hungary that Hungary and Poland, two good friends. It's like this, evidently it's this ancient, very simple saying that I just find it very funny. Like that's just, but sometimes you need to be stupid to make a mistake at the level that Europe is making. Common sense protects you. A lower IQ often protects you from the kind of stupid errors you can make by trying to get too cute and too smart. As a chess player, I know that firsthand often, but whatever, I won't get into that. Too many asides.
So let's move outside Europe, and before we do that, I will read a few super chat. There is so much of them. I'll try to go through them as fast as possible. There's lots of sponsors who are subscribing to the new sponsor program. Thank you so much for the support. DWarBucks, $20 US, says, good stuff as always, JF. The state of demographics may be uncomfortable to some, but it is a reality that must be acknowledged to have an honest conversation about the future. Also sub to Frame Game. He is good shit. His link is in the description below. He does awesome work on YouTube. He's one of the most in-depth YouTuber and the most underrated YouTubers. He is extremely serious about reporting information. He is a true journalist of the public space, and you should subscribe to him. DL $5 US says, can you guys talk about Africa's population being 4.4 billion by 2100 and what will happen to the world? We might cover this. Adolf Funkler says, JF, what's your opinion on the PB, the Pitbull question? Talk to Venti about it. Pinkies out for their furor. We must secure the existence of white pinkies. On Pitbulls, honestly, I don't like these dogs. I don't like violence. I don't like the idea of breeding a dog into existence that is more violent than the others. And so I'm kind of a pitbull exterminationist. Breakoff Animation says, envious of your work ethic, JF, keep it up and some. Benny says, demographics are like an avalanche. Jerica says, what happened to the Warski channel? High dislikes, what did I miss? Has he deleted a recent video? Yes, he did. I went today to talk to him, so watch the stream, the community of today on his channel if you want to see my discussion with him. Ghost of Nicolo says, great show, remember the Alamo and remember San Jacinto. God bless the Anglosphere and God bless the alt-right. LM says, what impact will automation play in these demographic trends? At some point there must be some kind of correction. Will UBI be the release valve? Honestly, I don't think that technology will play a role other than improving the lives of people where it emerges and therefore dragging more demands for migration into these places. I don't think that fundamentally technology will affect the birth rates that we're talking about. Hooper Croton says, fundamentalist Christians, oops, there's more super chats that have shown up. Fundamentalist Christians have much higher birth rates. Does FJ advocate them? I would say yes, that is right. For example, in the US, that's what gives me hope in the US. It's that the religious Christians seem to be involved in birth rates that are almost to the point of a Muslim in Canada, for example, not to that point, but close. And so this is what gives me hope in America. Frame Games, did you look at the birth rates for religious people in the US?
I did a little bit. I looked at old data. I actually didn't for this sweep, but I do know that statistically, those who are religious are have more kids than those who are atheists, and it's actually a fairly linear chart. That is, the more religious you are, the more you tend to have, the more children you tend to have within that. So, for religious Jews, Orthodox Jews have more children than Reformed Jews. Religious, Mormons have the most kids. Religious, the sort of large Catholic family, if they're practicing Catholic. I don't have the empirical data on hand. I remember being moved by it during my libertarian phase years ago. Feels like many moons ago now, but I do think that is a very solidly backed up fact.
And Nathan Dedinger says, well, this is all terrible stuff. Yeah, the idea now is to either do as much as we can to stop this and reverse it, which is very unlikely, or wait for the fall to get our bit of land as an ethno-state. Kev OSS says, immigrants needed for aging population, economy. The RSTN podcast says, hold on to your white orbs until 2070, sell the rest. Young Cordera says, more than 2K viewers on a channel with 38K subs. Kudos, JF, thank you. First name, last name says, everybody share this video with your family. Benevolent Tyrant says, watch Children of Men, our future will resemble it. In fact, there are many movies announcing what we're talking about today with facts, and maybe one day I will be doing a review of them. Titan, $20 Canadian, thank you so much. He says, why isn't force a viable option to counteract this hostile and genocidal immigration program forced on us in Canada? When will force be morally justifiable action? It seems obvious we can't vote ourselves out of this mess. Well, my answer to this is, why would you use force as a first strike? Use your right to exist as a basis for your philosophy. Advocate for an ethno-state if you think that this is the solution. Advocate for separation, for secession. And if you don't get what you want, if you see that you receive a violent reply to your desire, your legitimate desire to exist, then you will be much more justified in responding. Don't be the first striker. Talk about your existence, think about it, and build your political philosophy around it. But don't hesitate to reply when you are the victim of acts of aggression. Caesar did nothing wrong says, question for Frame, is the White Mother Fertility Fund still in the works, or are we just waiting for Jurassic Park technology release to bring back whites in 200 years? So Riley Wolf says, thanks for having Frame Games on. Great content. I think upcoming economic collapses will have massive consequences on demographics' future. What happens when no welfare? Hail Papa JF. Yeah, that's another reality that we haven't covered, but this whole immigration system being costly to societies, it leads to a reinforcing loop, but a reinforcing loop that maybe will bump on a brick wall at some point, Frame Games. At some point, this system is not maintainable. Are you still there, Frame? I think we lost him, so we will wait for him to come back. Tijuana Foreplay says, not to minimize concerns over Latino immigration. To ease your despair, not all brown people are alike. Hispanics are not Muslims. There's huge hope in that. Take heart, I'm kind of an expert on this. I agree, and nothing that we've said should be interpreted as everyone of a just because they can be labeled as a minority being the same. We're not saying they're the same. We're saying there's something disappearing from this world, and it is white people. Psych Drac says, love your work, Frame. Do you have any ideas on alternative methods of making digital donations that won't be frozen by activist payment processors? I don't know if Frame has an opinion on this.
I do.
I guess
that
Bitcoins. Yeah, we lost you for a while, but you're back.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, you hit the nail on the head. That is the promise of cryptocurrency. Although, as a sort of avid follower of that field, there's a lot going on with it. I think that there's still a chance. There's still currencies like Monero and Verge and a number of other ones. But Bitcoin itself is now totally trackable. The SPLC and Hate Watch can all basically do They can track Bitcoin transactions through a large network of affiliate transactions, tracking where something came from and where it's going, keeping sort of a longitudinal tab on it, and then wherever the money first came in, it all gets backtracked. So Bitcoin is no longer anonymous, but there's still the promise that cryptocurrency may, and I do think that that's a good point about economics, and I've thought about this a lot. That's one of my out cards, along with genetic engineering and giant death robots.
All right. Helen Sabatino says, will the results of the Italian election make any difference, Frame? What if Italy deports 600,000 migrants? I heard George Clooney got out of Italy.
Yeah, they may. I mean, this is the thing, right? We are right now at the stage right before it becomes critical. If there is a large national swell of sentiment in the next 2 to 4 years, then this really could be disarmed. I mean, if you had identitarian politics emergent, and then people in politics who are then able to use the hate speech laws that SJWs and other identity bloc groups instilled as protections for white interest and an enshrinement of white identity, you could actually see a tremendous amount of political power being poured into it. But it's instructive to see what's happening to countries that are currently trying to do that, like Poland and Hungary. So, right, JF, you mentioned earlier that these countries might turn nationalistic, and then refugees will have to go places elsewhere, like Canada. Well, what's happened is Poland and Hungary have refused to take in any migrants, and they've just been sanctioned, or at least sanctions have been approved to be placed on Poland and Hungary, basically trying to scram it down their throat. But they've been threatening those sanctions now for the better part of a year. And the fact that they have not been pushed through speaks to the fact that there may be a level of resistance power here that we may be underestimating in our tendency to sort of look only at the black pill side of life. So I think that what happened in Italy is absolutely amazing and wonderful, and really, it's all going to be in the follow through. What do they do with that momentum? Do they use it? Do they build on it, or do they use it as a stopping point? Is it the last hurrah, or is it a stepping stone to go towards true equality? That is truly letting people have being able to be treated as human beings and not just as second-class citizens in the nations that they build.
I admire your positive outlook on this situation. However, my response to the super chat is no. And yes, Poland may survive, but most countries will be affected. They will voluntarily subscribe to the migrant crisis. And as you point out, these countries who take up a part of the pie of cost of refugees or migration of immigrants, they will start saying, hey, why am I taking all of that cost? And they will start repressing violently other countries. We're talking about sanctions right now, but history of humanity tells us that if a country shows a little more nationalist pride than others around it, it ends up being ganged upon by the other countries, because every country wants the countries around them to be taking the migrants. And so I say I have a much more negative outlook, and I don't think that it's possible to stop the waves of migrants that we're seeing right now. Problematic Bob says, your estimates for the countries in the most advanced condition are probably too optimistic. We are aware of that. At a certain point, mass immigration for native whites could become the dominant factor. That's true. We've not covered that, but there may be white flight from countries. But that will happen at a state of desperation that it's almost not worth talking about it, because at the end at that point it will be really over, when people who are born in a country and who feel that it is their country will just give up everything and start elsewhere. Did you have any comments on the possibility of white immigration, Frame Games?
Yeah, well, I think that by the time it gets there, and when are you talking about sort of white emigration, as in like white flight on a national scale, like the people?
Yeah, people saying Canada is not white anymore, I'm going to Sweden, for example.
Right.
It's probably not going to be Sweden, but Poland maybe.
Well, it's funny you say that, because one of the next countries on the list is Australia, and Australia is often detested by its own left-wing newspapers as being the stereotypical safe haven white migration country. It's where white people go to migrate when they and it's I actually didn't know this about Australia until I started the research for this about a week and a half ago on this particular thread. Australia had a whites only immigration law that they started in the 1830s, and it wasn't until the 1970s that they actually did away with it. But Australia still has it still has the sort of reputation as being um, it's a lot like what libertarians said they do with New Hampshire. Like everyone moves to one state, and then you just control that one state, and now finally you have autonomy while the rest of the world kind of gets its just desserts. I actually think that China is going to play a big role in this. I think that emerging technology is going to change a lot of this in the next decade or two. I think that once you're able to change IQ with a designer baby, which is 5-10 years away, you're going to start seeing an evolutionary arms race with China, because China is extremely eugenic. And in order to compete with China, Western countries might need to start adopting eugenic policies. And that's sort of something that might actually kind of turn the boat around in a very weird but very realistic way. I think if that happens, you're going to see it from the poor whites will certainly immigrate, as they're trying to do in South Africa. But really, the rich whites are going to sort of, there's that meme about what does the future look like? It's a Jewish Asian overclass with a mixed race underclass clicking sponsored content all day. So I consider the sort of high IQ and sort of high income historically white families to stick around in their gated fences and basically extract profits from the underclasses, where they'll continue to own their businesses. You actually see this in South Africa, right? I mean, South Africa, I think white people still own like 70% of the land, even though they're 10% of the population. I mean, we always think about the atrocities that white South Africans face, and they are absolute ungodly atrocities at a physical level, at a legal level. At the same time, they are much more industrious than the people around them. And so you have this ridiculous inequality where they own the overwhelming lion's share of the land. The same thing will happen in Italy. The same thing will happen in France and Canada. You're not going to import people.
All right, so we have Alcibiades saying, you're redeeming all French people, JF. Jodo says, don't forget about the domino effect. Once one country falls, the others will follow much faster. Mark Gendelman says, do you see Western militaries taking over in the next 10-20 years so that the brown hordes don't take control of nukes, etc.? I think that militaries in Western civilization might participate to civil wars. I think 10 to 20 years is a very short time scale for this to happen. However, in the next 100 years, there may be militaries, including the military of the US, which may be confronted with a serious civil war, with a divide between a multicultural force and maybe a divide within whites. Some whites may be being on the side of building an ethno-state and seceding. Some whites may be on the side of building a immigration allowed and multicultural country, and it would be interesting to know what side the military would take in this. But I would say it's hard to make a predictions on this, because the side the military takes is contingent on many historical factors. It's very hard to predict decades in advance. Valentin says $50 US. Thank you so much for the donation. He says, I was born in Romania, but I moved to the US at a very early age. I've been around Romanian, Russian, and Ukrainian immigrants my entire life, and I have noticed that their birth rate seems to be quite high in the US. Is this simply anecdotal? Well, I would have to do more research. I don't know the extent of their religiosity. I wouldn't be surprised if the people you're talking about are religious, and if there's an increased birth rate, it could be associated with Orthodox Christianity, but I don't know. Controversial Matters, £5 says, who's going to protect Israel when whites are gone? That is a very good question, and that's why I say that many of the Jewish communities who support immigration in white countries, I don't think they realize the extent to which their decisions are unfavorable to their own existence and the existence of Israel. I don't think that they realize that one day a Muslim majority will take over a nation that has nuclear weapons, and France may be the first one. And so I think it's a very good question, and it's something that Jews who support immigration should think about. Frame Games, are you back? Okay, we lost Frame Games. I think he's having problems with his internet connection. So let's keep reading some super chat. We have Leecher, €5. He says, newsflash, primitive races have primitive reproductive strategy, a strategy of very high reproduction, hoping some of their offspring will survive.
Hello.
Hello, Frame
Okay.
Games, you're back. So I have
Yeah.
one last super chat to read, and then we can continue on outside Europe, what's
Great.
happening. Vinny
Great.
S, $50. Thank you so much for the donation. He says, does the fact that many Western nations with nuclear power will be ruled by minorities with different agendas, does that escalate the possibility for nuclear war? In my view, it absolutely does. I believe that some countries with nuclear weapon will be taken over by democratic forces who will be coordinating religiously, will be part of global religious networks like the Muslims, and it's not looking good for the outcome that this will result in on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that will likely be resolved just through intelligence and basically shutting down systems through cyber, basically through cyber warfare, cyber intelligence, cyber hacking. And I think that you can shut down a nuclear program. And we're certainly not far away from the era when American and Israeli technological dominance is so intense that if Zimbabwe tries to develop a nuclear program, we wouldn't need to roll up with tanks. We could just, we could probably just unplug them from basic technological infrastructure. I mean, I think especially with the advent of AI, a lot of this is going to be proxy wars rather than direct military conflict.
My God, Frame Games, you are such a positive man. I don't share at all your positivity on that. These countries will have their own intelligence system, and they will be able to learn the technologies that white civilization has developed. And think about it in this way, okay? To make a nuclear bomb 50 years ago, you needed to have a certain IQ. To make a nuclear bomb today, you can do it with a lesser IQ. And this threshold IQ for making technologically advanced weapons of mass destruction is going down every year, because a bridge that could be built 100 years ago by a genius engineer could be built today by a basic engineer, just because the knowledge gets refined, the education systems get refined, so that we can train less and less intelligent people at doing more and more advanced things. That's what's happening with cybersecurity and with weapons of mass destruction. And a nuclear bomb is extremely simple to build if you can refine the uranium. And so I don't share at all your positiveness, but I appreciate it.
So just one quick response to that is that, remember, you need to test nuclear bombs. So anyone who develops a nuclear bomb is going to have to test it to make sure that their technology works. And anytime they test it, now you've got 100 countries who are going to be able to detect that instantaneously through satellite and seismic reading data. So I think that's. But all right, I'll let that aside.
I mean, yeah, a good terrorist can build a shotgun-type nuclear bomb, a gun-type nuclear bomb, which is two sufficient mass of nuclear material that collide with each other without making a test. Yeah, I know what you mean, but I don't think that you measure the ease with which weapons of mass destruction will be constructible within the next 100 years. So let's get outside of Europe. And let's talk about Russia.
All right. So Russia is an interesting case because a lot of people see Russia as being sort of a solid block white country. And I think that's probably explains some of the affinity for Russia within some factions of nationalist movements. But the fact is, Russia has a very serious ethnic conflict issue with respect to their Muslim population. And it is actually huge. much more than I think anyone would have suspected, without knowing the specific facts. So in 2006, this is 12 years ago, Muslims were estimated to make up a majority of Russia's conscript army. That is their sort of militarily conscripted army, their low ranks. And by 2020, that's 2 years away, will be 20% of the population. And more than 50% of the population by mid-century, unless there is successful programs by the sort of Putin-Russia apparatus to increase Russian women fertility rates. So this has been a big program that Putin has been touting. Lots of benefits that you get for having children in Russia now, for having a family, and it's actually had a fair amount of success. I think Russia was down to like 1.3, totally below the 2.1 replacement. But now I think they're back up at like 1.8. They're climbing back up, and this has been a highly publicized thing that Putin has done. They have national fertility days now. It's a big thing now to try to increase the white female birth rate, in part because these Muslims in Russia, they have 4 or 5 kids. I mean, they have a tremendous amount of so just sheerly on the force of the fact that they're reproducing quicker. And even though it wasn't all migration, a lot of it was started on the outskirts, started in Ukraine, started in sort of not Russia proper. They're now a large part of Russian society. But fortunately, Russia is buffered by having sort of declared themselves a Orthodox Christian state. This is the same thing that Viktor Orban did in Hungary. It's a way, by declaring your national identity, you prevent the co-opting of political forces. So while there's a big threat to Russia, that in 2100 it will be majority non-white, I think that probably they just won't be able to amass the political power to really hit the accelerator on that. And I suspect that the Orthodox Catholics in Russia will have a lot more resistance to the Muslims there than the British do to Muslims in London.
Yeah, I have no doubt.
But there is a big problem in Russia. It's estimated that over the last 15 years, millions of Russian women have been ensnared in the Arab slave trade, sold as slaves, mainly to Muslim and Asian countries, but also to Israel. This was a big sort of black mark on Israel's international reputation when this came out, I think in the 1950s, that there was a lot of sort of white slave trade running through some of the new settlers to Israel. But yeah, Russia is taking, unlike these other countries, even though it looks demographically bad for Russia, they are taking proactive measures. They are monitoring and measuring it. But it is nothing. If nothing is done, it will become Muslim. So,
all right.
So then we'll go to Australia, and then maybe we'll wrap up the tour here. So, So Australia, I mentioned earlier, has this interesting history of being very explicitly white only, and they also are adamantly anti-refugee. So they have this famous policy that they actually got in some trouble for in international newspapers, that if people from Africa tried to take boats into Australia, that Australia would shoot them, right there in the water. There was someone in the cabinet in Australia said that. But that does typify sort of the attitude there. But Australia has 2 sort of demographic threats. One is the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, but the bigger one is actually Asia. There is a lot of Asian immigration into Australia since Australia got rid of its white priority immigration system in the 1970s. And it's actually huge now. Australia is now becoming more Asian than European. More than half of its residents, 50.7, have parents who were not born in Australia. That is, they don't have 2 Australian-born parents. More than a quarter of kids are born overseas, and for the first time in Australian history, the majority of people born abroad are going to be from Asia within 3 years, instead not Europe. So, again, they're sort of at stage 1 of this, not where Sweden is, but sort of in the pre-Sweden stage. And from what I hear about people in Australia, they have been politically disempowered to they can't pull a Russia and start shoring themselves up, a Russia or a Poland or a Hungary. So I do fear for Australia, and I do think that by 2100 you could be looking at a minority white Australia. Certainly, New Zealand is under that threat.
All right.
So then,
And
I
now
guess the last
there-
one. Sorry,
Yeah,
just
there are
Africa.
countries like Poland and Hungary, which we've talked about, and it's the general wisdom that they will remain white, but that's if the countries around them don't put so much pressure on them that they end up abdicating to the multicultural tendencies of the rest of Western civilization, right?
That's exactly right. And I'm watching it like a hawk, because if you remember, Poland moved to do the first anti-Jewish hate speech law. That is to say, if you remember, Poland decided they passed in Parliament a resolution that would make it illegal to attribute blame to Poland for the death camps during World War II, and this is effectively a way of preventing Poland from being blamed for any war crimes, and also stymieing the entire cottage industry within Poland that regularly extorts it for money and political favor. So Poland has been gutted in the post-war period by organized Jewish groups like the World Jewish Congress and many others. I can go into in another stream maybe. They have been shaken down, not just in terms of their treasury, but at a political level. And Poland has sort of teamed up with Hungary and Russia to some extent to kind of form this phalanx against a number of the anti-identitarian and pro-diversity policies. And this was a huge deal when Poland passed this resolution. It was really the first time anyone since 1945 has taken any sort of organized action about the Holocaust or about blame for World War II that does not toe the sort of World Jewish Congress line. And what ended up happening was all the Israel ambassadors flew to the U.S. and they demanded that Trump threaten sanctions on Poland if Poland did not renege this law. So it was a huge thing because there was a lot of political will for it. It even went through the first phase of Congress, but then Poland ultimately scrapped the law from the books and said, okay, listen, we still like it in theory, so we're going to come back to it in a couple of years. But basically, Israel and the U.S. strong-armed Poland getting out of the extortion racket that is the diversity industry. Now, they hadn't been strong-armed on migrants yet, so they're somewhere between those two levels in terms of their political strength.
All right, so we will conclude on that. What I will say is I've titled this stream The End of White Civilization because the facts that are brought to us today are, to me, an extension of the white race, at least in terms of its power over its countries. And to the extent that other people coming in will use our societies as shells, but that they will not be able to maintain these shells in the state that they were before, I do consider that a lot of this data speaks to the end of the existence of certain countries, of certain ethnicities. And even if these ethnicities survive in local areas, I think that they are losing political power, which is a key to self-preservation. That's why I decided to call this stream that way. Frame Games is a man of facts. He comes here and he drops these facts, and I greatly appreciate. But I, as a communicator, I have a duty to let the audience know what I think about this. And what I think about this is that white civilization it's not even at risk. It's that the path on which it is currently engaged is certainly leading to a loss of control of its own countries and its own capacity to regulate in a way that preserve its own existence. Maybe a few thoughts about the solution, because we have a super chat from Jonathan Leporati. He says, what can we do today to best make change in Canada? It seems we truly need protected speech and a stronger conservative identity, not just PC neocons. I personally, I'm a very nihilistic and negative guy. I say there is no way you will save Western civilization countries. What we can do is develop local areas, flee the world that is building around you, and create local communities where arbitrary rules can be applied through a sense of community. What if a old town was white people gathering together and saying, our town will look like Western civilization used to be 50 years ago? What if all the policemen applying the law in an area of the country would refuse to apply hate speech laws? I think that segregation, balkanization is the only hope to preserve white civilization in any capacity. Frame Games, what are your concluding thoughts on what we've discussed tonight?
Well, I want to thank you so much for having me. Always a real pleasure to trade ideas with you. I like that we have certain areas of disagreement, even if only in a sort of good cop, bad cop way. I think it's very fun to bat these ideas around with you. I think you're doing God's work here with what you've developed. I think it's incredibly unique, and I hope that everyone learned from this. I think what would be maybe a good future conversation would be to really understand the specific mechanisms, like who all is behind this. I mean, I mentioned organizations like the World Jewish Congress and a few others that kind of exert this international influence. I think it would be useful to have a skeleton sketch of all these organizations, and I've chronicled them, pretty much writ large. So I'd love to have a future stream on that topic. But
absolutely, I'm very interested in this. I've been doing a lot of research on the extent of the power of organizations like those of George Soros over American politics. And I think that together we could draw a general sketch around the world of to what extent these billionaire power influence the course of things and the way our lawmakers are adopting strategies and adopting various laws. I'm very interested in doing this, maybe next week, maybe in 2 weeks, but let's talk about it.
Great. Just one final word is that I think that JF and I just did a highly shareable stream. So I would really encourage everyone who watched this, if you got something out of it, if you're entertained or educated, please share it on your social media accounts. I think that if more people knew this, then maybe it could change the world. But okay, thanks again, JF, and thanks again, chat. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for this great report. You are really an impressive man of facts, and you report with a quality that I've never seen on the internet. Thank you for being here. Thanks to our crowd, and go subscribe to Frame Games. He does work like this on his channel every week. There's new stuff coming up. He's a great man of YouTube. Go follow him and have a great day.
All right. Good night, guys.